Hello, I'm Edwin Smith, and this is World of Wealth, the podcast from Spears Magazine. My guest today is Natasha Silver Bell, the founder of SilverBell Global, a company that helps sufferers of substance use disorder and the mental health issues that it stems from. Welcome, Natasha Silver Bell. It's so great to have you with us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Now, your company, SilverBell Global, it supports sufferers of substance use disorders and the underlying mental health issues that they stem from. And there are various strands involved in the business and your practice, and we can get into all of those in detail a little bit later on. But could we just start with you talking a little bit about the ethos that underpins what you do?
Oh, thank you so much. I love what I do. I love helping people. I'm a woman in recovery, and so my journey started over 20 years ago. And I think, you do what you love because it has a deep personal resonance within you. And if you love what you do, you'll never work a day in your life. And I feel like that all the time. I'm excited for work. I'm excited to wake up and see if I can be helpful, whether they use my company or not. I just want them to get into the right hands because it's a very vulnerable state to be in, to say, here are my family problems and I need help.
And part of the reason that we're talking today is because a lot of what you do has a special connection to Spears and the Spears audience and what we cover, although of course it's slightly different from our usual coverage. People from all walks of life struggle with the kinds of problems that you deal with, but your work kind of shows that wealthy people are not immune from these problems, and in fact, sometimes they might be even more susceptible than normal people to these types of problems. Could we talk about why that is the case and what sorts of issues tend to lead to the sorts of things that you see?
Thank you for bringing this to your audience. It's a tender and important conversation to have, and I'm incredibly mindful about the words I speak and how it might land in someone listening today, because more money seems to beget more problems, and certainly over time or over generations. And it's certainly happening a little bit more and more in this modern age. And there was a book that came out last year by Jennifer Wallace, Mike Wallace's niece. It's called Never Enough. And she was looking in 2019 for an at-risk youth group. Mm-hmm. And she came across a study at Harvard with 6,500 youth, and she found that the top 20% of affluent families in America were at risk for substance use disorder, self-harm, suicide ideation, eating disorders, chronic depression, anxiety, because there was this feeling that they'll never be good enough. There's never enough. And so she created a foundation called the Mattering Project, and to have mattering moments. And so although her study came out in 2019, and thank goodness she published her book, and she's someone you should have on your podcast. If you're listening, Jennifer, I hope that you'll come. Because I think what she's saying with grace and compassion is parents have an opportunity to change the narrative of their home, mm-hmm. so that getting into the right college isn't being okay, so that having the right internship isn't success. It's just a piece of that human being, their child. And I'm a mom of 3 too, so I'm with all the parents that might be listening. I'm never going to speak at them. And I'm in this journey to figure out how I can make my children feel valued, seen, and whole, regardless of their performance. And there's a performance culture out there that's happening as well. So
really we're talking about the danger that the environment that a child grows up in makes them feel that they aren't enough, that their worth is only contingent on ticking certain boxes or doing certain things, and it's about understanding those pressures. Is that
That's exactly right. And parents, you don't even realize the messaging you're having. How are you doing on your A levels, and what is your SAT score, and then you'll be okay. You can almost feel the parents exhale. Well, if they could just get through their senior year, if they could just get through this, but then what? Wherever you go, there you are. And the messaging, the neuroscience behind the nervous system, what is the messaging that you're saying without even verbalizing that? Kids can pick up on that. They're sponges.
Absolutely. And when we've spoken in the past, you've mentioned something that I thought was very interesting, this phenomenon of craving, you've called it in the past. And that's kind of tied into the next thing and the next thing and the next thing, isn't it? Can you talk about what you mean by that?
Sure. I think it's a lot of human behavior and condition that we're striving to be successful and succeed and have legacy. So there's a biology to it from, beginning of time, if you will, since man was created. And I think that phenomenon of craving is something that happens when something outside of ourselves makes us feel okay. And so if we can learn how to have a sense of peace within, we aren't going to need to reach outside of ourselves for a substance, for a behavior, for a person. If they're okay, if this is okay, then I'm okay. And so learning how to manage our own internal anxiety is the work that we primarily help the families do. But we could go into a deep, dark hole that way, whichever way feels best.
Sure. Well, first of all, let's just talk about how that inability of some people to feel right in themselves and to regulate themselves leads to more serious problems, or can lead to more serious problems. What's the classic or archetypal case that you see and that you're aware of from your work?
We're seeing a lot of marijuana use that leads to a lot of anxiety. And so a lot of the kids will say, oh, but I'm smoking to calm my anxiety down, if they actually knew it's having the opposite effect on them. And it creates a habit, of course, turns into a dependency, which turns into an addiction. I love to quote Charlie Munger, the bonds of addiction are too loose to be felt until they're too tight to be broken. And it's just, it's not something that one wants to wake up. I've never met somebody who says, I want to be an addict today. It's something that happens subtly over time.
Sure. And then, of course, so it progresses from not feeling the way one might like to feel in themselves, then therefore turning to a substance or some other kind of what feels like relief, but doesn't necessarily provide it in the long term. Other than substance abuse, are there other kinds of things that people turn to?
The gaming industry, even our phones, myself included. I intentionally put my phone out of an arm's reach often to train myself not to have that response. So even if I reach for it out of just a blind movement, it's not there. Mm-hmm. So I'm really changing my pathways in my brain to not have that dependency.
Sure. And then so once there are various ways in which, I'm sure that no individual and no client of yours is the same, but once they have turned to sort of an exterior means to sate these feelings in the short term, and they become bigger, sort of self-fulfilling problems in the longer term, how does that tend to develop? What does that look like?
What a good question, really breaking it down. Let me pause for a minute and think about how to share this. So what might begin as a 14-year-old just experimenting with drugs from an older sibling, a cousin, a friend, just in the playground, the walk in the park, randomly, oh, it's no big deal, to, oh, well, it didn't bother me then, it didn't hurt me then, and that was curious. And there's always a sense of rebellion in teenagers normally. So it feels naughty, or it feels like I shouldn't, even if it's legal. I mean, the legal age for marijuana in some of the states in America is still 21. So your brain is still developing till you're 27. And so when you are hyper doing something that is a habit, even if you think it's every weekend, so it might graduate to every weekend, you're still building that chemical into your brain, into your neural pathways. And what happens is studies show that if you can hold off, prevent, or delay, like me, for example, my parents did a really good job of telling me no. Doesn't mean I listened. I went behind their back. I was sneaky. I was quiet. I was cute, so nobody bothered me. I was still doing things I shouldn't have done, but they made it a little bit harder because I had curfews and I had consequences. So by the time I left the house at 19, I then, unbeknownst to me, developed an addiction, but I was closer to 20. So studies show that if you can prevent or delay chronic use until the age of 20, the chances of someone becoming addicted are far less than if they are, allowed, or they can get the substance a lot before age 16. And so people who become addicted before age 16 don't have those high chances of recovery. And that's chronic. That's not a blanket statement. But I hope that's answering your question, because I've gone a couple different pathways. But what starts out as fun, playful, and then all of a sudden, before you know it, you're addicted, like Charlie Munger says, and you don't even realize it.
Sure. And then, well, I'd love to talk a little bit about your journey later in our conversation, but let's just, discuss how those things develop. So, think of one of the clients that comes to you, they might have developed this addiction, and then that obviously leads to various things breaking down in their lives, and certain drugs would lead to a very clear and obvious problem for people, and but other kinds of addiction can lead to less obvious problems. But then all of these different types of people are ending up working with you and your colleagues and the people that you refer them to. How does that journey kind of tend to develop, and how do they tend to end up at your doorstep, figuratively?
So what begins as casual use turns into chronic use. And by the age of 18, I'm getting a lot of phone calls. And so 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, really there's this window of kind of knocking on our door saying, they're not showing up for school. They're hanging out with people I don't really like. They're being defiant. They're being rude, dismissive. And I don't know what to do about it. I don't want to send them away to treatment, but I can't manage this in home. We're going to have to take a gap year, not go to university, or we're going to have to delay this, or we can't take them on holidays anymore because it's so disruptive to the family unit. And so that's just the beginning of the consultation. We have youth prevention mentors, an adolescent program that will refer them to in order to mitigate or slow down so they don't have to go away. And then what happens about 50% of the time is then they do end up coming 22, 23, 24 into needing more serious support, which is what our company provides, because it takes a lot with the family system. So I hope I've answered some questions there.
Absolutely. And one of the things that, from my layman's interpretation, makes this more prevalent or can make it more prevalent in certain ways in wealthy families is the availability of various means to sort of sate this phenomenon of craving. Do you think that's true, that wealthy young people find access to the certain things that might in the long term hurt them? Do they find it easier? Is that something at play here?
There always is an allowance. There's resources, and because money's not physically touched anymore, it makes it even more like gambling chips, that it doesn't matter.
Sure.
And so a dime bag of this or a gram of that becomes nothing when you don't have to manage your money in a Metro card, if you will.
And what about we did talk about how the conveyor belt of education and achievement feeds into this, but do you think that the exclusive schools that many of the people that we're talking about will attend or want to attend, do you think the environment in those places is not necessarily helping this phenomenon the way it might be?
Oh, that's a loaded question. Do you want an honest answer?
Yes, please.
Oh, God bless you then. I'll give you one. I think that what I have learned over the years and my own experience is the children, the teenagers that are suffering from a loss of connection with their primary parent. And I know there's a culture here in the UK, of course, to go to boarding school early. And although that's a lovely way to create autonomy and independence, which is nice, there's always a longing for family. There's always a longing for home. And it can be done through boarding school. It can, with the right type of mattering, like Jennifer Wallace is talking about, a deep connection. So when you do see your child, you're not on your phone, you drop in, you do what they want to do so that they can go back to their studies and feel really validated and seen and heard. And then there's this life that we have. There's obligations, there's galas, there's committees, there's events, there's not bad things, but when parents are so distracted, and I'm guilty as charged. I'm not speaking at anyone, and I've had to learn how to say no, and no, I'm going to be with my kids tonight, and I'm going to prioritize their safety and well-being by rhythm, structure, routine, bedtime. I'm going to be present. I'm going to be home. That matters.
As you see it, is there a way to mitigate some of the pressures of the kind of the conveyor belt that we see. We see there's children under pressure to get into the top schools when they're, only 9 or 10, or perhaps even younger, when they're studying for exams, taking tutoring outside of lessons and so forth. That puts a lot of pressure on them. Then once they get in, it's about the exam results. It's about various sort of markers of achievement, and then university and internships and all the rest of it. That's all happening while someone's still developing, and it's a lot of pressure. But at the same time, that elitism is what makes the school successful to a degree, and what attracts people. Yeah. Is there a way to kind of better balance those two forces? Or are we just stuck with this forever?
We're not. I think we should follow Sir Anthony Sheldon's advice. Anything he says is brilliant about education. So hopefully he's listening and he'll come on your show and talk about that, because the way he has managed the schools and the expectations is spot on. Mm-hmm. So whatever he's doing, follow.
So we should explain to our listeners that we hosted a breakfast together where Sir Anthony Sheldon, who's now the head of Epsom, joined us, and he was fantastic and very good on creating the right environment for young people as well. And he actually began our talk that day with a session to sort of help people become present and feel there in the moment, which was quite interesting. And that links to some of the work that you have done around vagal theory, if I'm using the right terminology.
Yes, you are.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yes, very good. So having Sir Anthony take 85 participants, Spears, guests, and our behavioral health relationships in London come together in a morning and sit down to talk about mental wealth and what does that mean. And having Sir Anthony pause only for 2 minutes and walk us through a mindful meditation of silence where he guided us. I think meditation sounds really scary, like a monk sitting on the top of a mountain all alone. Well, that's not reality. Mm-hmm. And so having someone guide you, even in a gentle conversation about being where your feet are, and just pausing to check in, that's really all it is. Did anything shift for you in that moment?
It does. And when he did it on the day, I was very surprised at how I felt different. I think you could feel the energy in the room, as people say. It did shift, yeah.
It did. And if we were to do that for 2 minutes, that might bore your listeners right now. But maybe that's something to explore with Sir Anthony when he comes on. But in order to do that, one has to be aware of it. Mm-hmm. And that's what I loved about collaborating with you. So thank you again for being a leader like that and talking about these challenging conversations, because most people don't know how to slow down, me included. I had to learn this, but the only way I learned it was by listening to people I'm not going to pick up a meditation book. That's kind of silly. Sometimes for someone who's on the go, I was in New York City for 26 years. So how did I learn how to slow down? By associating and listening to people who I wouldn't think, like if you and I were sitting at a lunch, I wouldn't think you would start talking about meditation. Mm-hmm. But because maybe you would now, it would land in my nervous system as like a real moment to pause and go, the editor of Spears magazine is talking about meditation? Man, that must be important. I'll listen now. Versus walking into a yoga studio where you expect it. Sure. So go ahead.
That was one of the things that came out for me because, as you say, this is not the traditional territory for a title that's known for coverage of the wealth management industry. But our audience on the day was primarily advisors to ultra-high net worth individuals from wealth management, private banking, law, and so forth. And they had absolutely no problem with the ideas that were being presented. There was a real appetite for understanding the forces that are shaping their clients' lives and for looking at this from a slightly, what would have been considered a few years ago, even a slightly left field perspective. And so it shows there is an appetite in even the sort of traditionally staid white collar professional services kind of industry for an understanding of what we're talking about here. And there is a shift, but I think you think there's further that we need to go.
Oh, there's always, that's that, survival and to push the envelope, that craving for more. So we have this desire for more. It's just a human condition to accept that. But how we channel it, and that's what I like to do. I have a very all or nothing mentality, and I've tried to slow that down so that I can pause and go, what is in the best interest of my talents that I've been given and my relationships and how I can help people find different pathways of healing. And so there's lots of envelopes to be pushed, shall we say. They call it a growth edge. And I think Spears Magazine has shown their growth edge. And I always say, if I'm the smartest person in the room, I'm in the wrong room. So please help me find new rooms to be exposed to. So again, I'm just so grateful for your openness to take your audience there.
We were thrilled to work on it with you. And I think with the response we got from it showed how much of an appetite there is for it. But yes, let's just go back briefly to that idea of polyvagal theory, because I think it's a really interesting way to understand the states that people are in. And I was reading about it last night, actually, and one of the things that struck me was someone said, once you understand something, you have the power to change it, once you sort of take stock. And I think perhaps many of the people who go down that road when they need your company and your services, they haven't necessarily kind of been able to take stock of what's happening to them and their nervous system. So can you talk to us about how would they might do that, or how we might do that?
Beautiful. So, well, this Sunday, actually, we're hosting with Deb Dana. She is the co-founder of the Polyvagal Institute, and the polyvagal theory was created by Stephen Porges. And she was the licensed clinical social work that said, I'm going to make this teachable. And she created books and modalities and techniques to take this research to talk about the nervous system in therapy with patients in order to help them regulate when they're activated. Some people call that triggered. We don't like to use that word so much anymore in our world because of all the mass shootings in the States. And so not something you would want to use when, a gun violence. And so when you think about when you get activated, like we get activated all the time. Do I know I'm getting activated? Hopefully this conversation will bring a sense of awareness. And then once I am activated and my nervous system and I have anxiety and I'm anxious, what do I do and how do I bring myself back down to what they would call a ventral state? There's 3 states. There's ventral, there's sympathetic, and there's dorsal. And Deb Dana has great techniques and tools. So this Sunday, she's actually flying in. We do some retreats with Lady and Lord Northampton up in North Hampshire. This whole week is coming up. But in preparation for that, we've invited some guests up to, and our team flies in from around the world, to do a day-long training. And then Deb takes us on some virtual trainings with our coaches because we have a very, there's no training out there for what this. I've kind of created my own little niche because, to your point, what we're doing with our clients is helping them learn how to regulate their nervous system. So if they get emotionally dysregulated, which then they reach for drugs or anger or an eating disorder, whatever, self-harm, that they know how to bring themselves back down into a peaceful state. And there's techniques that we help do that. And oftentimes, someone is so dysregulated in our work that we couldn't walk them through how to do that verbally. So what our companions who are trained in this modality come in to do is through co-regulation. So right now, we're in a peaceful state of mind. I think we're very co-regulated, right? And we don't need each other for that, but that's what happens with people when they're in that proximity. So if someone with a lot of energy walks in, we might get a little bit more hyper. Right? And that's okay because we're not going to become dysregulated and act out. But our clients do, because then what happens is they've reached for a drug so they can regulate themselves, and they didn't learn how to do that without the substance. So our job is through our nervous system. So a lot of what Deb will say is, Natasha, what your families are doing is they're not buying the knowledge, the academia, the trainings. What they're buying is your nervous system. That's what they're paying for with our companions who live in their family. When a powerful energy walks in that knows how to find peace no matter the adversity that's around it, what's that worth to you in order to get your family life back in a peaceful state of mind day after day?
And this, just to explain, is one of the services that your firm provides, which is to provide companions to help families who are struggling with some of these things to deal with them.
Exactly. And so it was a new phenomenon when I met Deb a few years ago. And then I said, and she trains the trainers. Like she doesn't, she's a very senior woman these days, but you wouldn't know it. She's so full of life, but yet there's a peace and calm about her. And so she said, I would like to train your coaches. And I was like, oh my gosh, I feel so in awe right now of this opportunity. And by doing that, the coaches then, what we have gotten into very much so is to make sure that our coaches are doing their work. Because if they don't have their primary therapist or their support system and they're not checking in on their mental health and well-being consistently. Whether they're on a case or off a case, we're checking in on them to make sure they're okay.
Sure.
Because when they come back into the family home, we better make sure they're in a peaceful state of mind to offer that. You can't give away what you don't have mentality, right? Cup runneth over to spill over, but if it gets depleted, then we want to make sure they're getting taken care of too.
Absolutely. And I'd like to talk a bit more about what you offer to your clients and the different ways in which you help them. But perhaps before we get there, it might be nice to talk about the journey that you went on to found the company.
Sure.
But let's go right back to the start, if we may. You grew up in Montana, in sort of basically in the TV show Yellowstone, from what I understand.
I did, actually. Yeah, it is. It is. So Paradise Valley, Livingston, Montana, is actually where the show Yellowstone claims to be filmed. And they do some filming there now, but it's where 1883 ends up. He brings his daughter to Paradise Valley, and that's where she then dies, and he builds the Dutton family, which I believe actually is based on the family called the Story family in Montana. They were the first family to come to Montana with cattle and settle. There used to be a mini-series in the 80s called Lonesome Dove. Those listening might know it, and that was the same story of the Dutton family, which is the Story family. And they still have, like, I think 17,000 acres. We're not supposed to talk about acres in Montana. It's like asking someone's wealth, like, what do you have in your bank? But I just expose them. They're not talking about it. I am. And they're at the end of Paradise Valley, and they're still there, and a lovely family. So our family pioneered a little bit before them, actually. Our families did know each other. I think we're married in down the road somewhere. But you know, there's a pioneering spirit in me, and I think it comes from my ancestors. And we've done our tracing, and we do come from England in 1640, Samuel Allen. So it's the Allen family name, and it was Dwight Allen who homesteaded in 1862.
So fantastic. So you're, I think, sixth generation of this family to be in Montana, and when we talk on a Zoom call, I see the background sometimes. It looks absolutely spectacular.
Yeah, it's not made up. It's real.
Your father was an academic, I think. Is that right?
And my mom. Yeah, both. Most of my family is.
Okay.
Yeah. He's an architect, and my mom is actually a licensed clinical social worker. So I grew up with language that I use today. And my parents were great parents. Now, are they perfect? No. But man, did they do a good job with structure and rhythm. There were some highs and lows, but I think that's important for children to go through. Adversity is the cornerstone, overcoming adversity. When a lot of parents I work with, obviously the ultra high net worth, very successful men and women, they'll say, well, tell me your definition. And they're interviewing me if they're going to hire me. I've had them really come right at me. What's your definition of success? And da-da-da-da-da. And I'll say, overcoming adversity. There's nothing more important than that. So, our scars tell the story.
Absolutely. And throughout, you started your career, I think, in sort of modelling. Am I right in thinking you won a beauty pageant?
I did.
And then that led to modelling. Can you tell us how that happened?
A little bit of both and.
Yeah.
We ended up moving to the southwest corner of Michigan. And my father was the dean of architecture at a Christian university, Andrews University. And there was some local modeling in Chicago, Detroit area, and then there was an opportunity to go out for Miss Michigan, and I won and went to Miss USA, and I was very young and naive, but great stories to tell.
And then is that what led to moving to New York and the career that you had there?
It was, and I was with Ford Models for a while, and then 9/11 happened, and the world changed, and the fashion houses shut down, and everything came to a standstill, so it was a very different time. 2001, and I got pregnant with my son shortly after.
And around this time, leading up to that time, that, as I understand, was the time that you were starting to experience some of the things that you now help to treat and help others to overcome. Is that right?
I was, very much so. My addiction was full on, and I had no idea. I was the last to know. We usually are, Everyone else knows, but not me. I even had one of the fashion houses say to me, do you have a problem with drugs and alcohol, Natasha? And I was like, no. Of course, at that point, when someone points it out, I knew I was using every day. But I wasn't going to tell them. They were still hiring me after all, so I would lose my job,
And then you've used a way of phrasing it that I found very interesting and telling, that turning it around It's like a jumbo jet in the air. You know, you can't just decide one day, this is over. I've lived in a suboptimal way, and I'm going to change it, and then I'm going to be perfect from now on. It doesn't really work like that.
Yeah,
It's
people
different.
who have the biological makeup that I do, and I've done genetic testing now post my recovery, and I have the genes that are more predominant for addiction. I did have an uncle that passed away from this disease at 43. Norwegian bloodlines have a lot of, at least in our family, it was the Bell side of the family. I love you, Dad. You know, there is a genetic predisposition, but that's not everything. It also is environment and circumstances. Mm-hmm. When I did finally learn that I needed to stop, it was only because I became pregnant. Okay. And thank goodness, thank you, Jesus. No, really, because I don't think I would have been savable. I needed an intervention. I needed to be stopped. I needed what I do now. I needed me then. I think that's why I do what I do.
Fantastic. And so that was the big change in your life, and that developed. But then, I mean, there's a distance between that coming into your life and then you kind of starting to launch this company and help others. Can you tell us how that happened?
Oh, gosh. Through the grace of God. Honestly, I gave birth to my son Samuel. He's 21 now, and he's out in Los Angeles in music production and doing incredibly well, and what a gift to have him. And he was 13 months old when I was in a blackout with him in New York City. And it's not my proudest moment, but it's something, and it's an honest moment that has helped a lot of mothers. And I stumbled into the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous, and I know we're supposed to remain anonymous on press, radio, and film. It's one of our traditions, but I think, you know, saying how I got my journey is my story. Mm-hmm. And I surrendered to something that I didn't know what it was, but I knew that I needed help. And 30 days into me counting days and trying to stay sober, I became pregnant with my second child, and that was another gift. And then became, to beat one addiction, you have to replace it with another one. And so that's passion and purpose for a lot of people, which I have now. But at the time, I became Mother Earth, and I co-slept my children. I nursed my children. I was present. I was grounded. I was sober. It was beautiful. And then when my middle son was born, I didn't know you could get pregnant while you were nursing. And so I was pregnant with my daughter when Benjamin was only 9. My second child was 9 months old. And then I gave birth to my daughter. And when she was about 18 months old, there's this common idea that one day you'll be able to manage your drinking safely. And I thought, well, I'm a mom now. Everything's okay. And so I had a 6-month relapse, what they call. And I went out of the program because I thought I had it all figured out.
Okay.
Right, I've got it. I'm fine. I'm just going to have a little wine. What's the big deal? Well, I didn't realize how much I really disliked wine anyways. Well, liquor's quicker, don't they say? And so I was within a few days that I was going right back to vodka. And so anyways, it took me 6 months to really surrender and admit complete defeat. On August 5th, 2008 was my last drink or drug. But it's been a 20-year journey because I had 4 years and then a relapse. And I needed that, what we call research, to know what I didn't know. And it gave me the recovery I have today. So a lot of parents who might be listening or people who understand recovery, I hate to say it, but it's true. Relapse is part of the process. Don't give up. Just because you have a slip, just because you turned left when you should have gone right. Find your way back. Have hope. And so I then realized that I needed to step away from the family, that the father of my children. And with that came responsibility to provide for myself, which I took as a beautiful opportunity to understand how I could be helpful to others. And I did not mean to start my company. I got certified as a coach, and recovery coaching was something new in New York City at the time. And I was part of a study to become the first certified recovery coaches in New York State. And I went through that credentialing process, which was lovely. And a lawyer gave me my first shot, Arthur Ettinger.
Perhaps we should talk a little bit about how you realized that was something that you could do, that was sort of an option for you or an outlet for your experience. And as I understand, you had spoken to fellow parents, and that's kind of how you developed this idea that you could do this.
That's right, fellow parents and colleagues. So I was going to a lot of I was very open, let's say, about my recovery. And so I would go to a lot of lunches and galas and dinners and socially out. And I was very open. I mean, a lot of people knew I had a drinking problem, but I didn't until I knew I had it. And so when I would sit at a lunch or a gala and my girlfriends would be sitting next to me going, or acquaintances, wait, you're not drinking? Why not? And it wasn't something I was jonesing to tell, excited to tell, but it was an honest conversation. I said, well, I'm not drinking anymore. Oh, you're not? Why? And I was like, well, I have a problem with it. I learned that I can't drink safely anymore, so I'm just choosing to be a part of, quote unquote, the no matter what club. We don't pick up. And it's a household. It's in every home. So if it's not the loved one, it's someone they know. And so by just being forthright about my story, other mothers and friends would be like, oh my gosh, could you speak to so-and-so? Could you speak to so-and-so? And there was no business at the time. It was just me being helpful.
And so your journey really was to be talking about these issues in the circles that you were in, discovering that people were going through the same sorts of things. That enabled you to see that there was, a receptive audience for what you could give, what you could offer. And then that turned into a more formal offering through a contact of yours, which was a lawyer, as I understand.
That's correct. So Arthur Ettinger, thank you, Arthur. And I've thanked him many times, but I'll always continue to thank him. He said, you have an organization, right? You have an LLC. I said, yeah, I did create one. He says, great. And so I began working with a woman coming out of treatment, a mother of two, who was in jeopardy of losing her children in a divorce. He was a matrimonial attorney. And so he said, would you just, go meet with her a few times a week and try to help her be a sober mom? And sure enough, I went over several times during the week, and I would, play board games. I would do chores. We would go grocery shopping, learn how to walk down the aisles that don't have alcohol, really learn how to be a present and grounded mom, because being a sober mom is very different than a mother who even has a little bit of alcohol in her system on a daily basis, And so learning how to regulate when your 2-year-old has a snotty nose and the zipper's stuck and he's crying and screaming and you're sleep deprived. How do you keep your cool? How do you breathe through that polyvagal theory and because I had been where she was. And I think that's such a unique perspective that needs more consideration, and certainly is now these days, to take the lived experience of someone like me to model how to do this. It's so much, we need great clinicians, but it's a both and moment to work together. And so she would watch me parent her children without being activated, calmly just picking up the spilled milk, the crayons, getting the children to work together. You get the red ones, I'll get the blue ones, instead of just getting angry that they won't do it. And so, thank you for taking me back there. I haven't really thought about it. I know I tell the story, but embody it. And after about 6 weeks, the lawyer calls me and he says, okay, so the forensic psychologist, Dr. Marvin Aronson, would like to meet with you. He's been overseeing your work with the patient. I was like, imposter syndrome. Gee, you think you could have given me a heads up? And he was like, no, you're doing fine. Just go in and tell him what you're doing. I was so scared. And I went in and I met with him, and he had his glasses and in his chair with his notepad. And he says, tell me what you're doing with my patient. And I was like, oh, shit. And so I was like, okay. And I explained everything I just shared with you about the games and learning how to do sticker charts and clean together and shop together and not become activated. And he slowly lips up and he goes, because it's working. Oh. And he started referring me mother after mother after mother in his practice, because most people who end up with a forensic psychologist in their life at some point is because they're going through a toxic divorce that needs to show who's the better primary parent. And so their analysis dictates what will become for those children's lives. And he was wise enough to bring in social workers, and he started working with me and teaching me how to manage, because I couldn't live with the client, but I could go every day. And then he said to me, I have a case with a mother of 4 on Park Avenue who needs someone to live with them because she's in jeopardy of losing her children, and she's the best primary parent. We've got to give her an opportunity to do this right. And we put together the model that I still execute today, 12 years later.
Okay.
And it is a forensic in-home intensive, I don't want to use the word documentation, but we're bringing information, our feedback, accurate reporting to the clinical team through a portal. So daily notes are sent to the lead psychiatrist, the lead psychologist. There are team meetings. There's daily communication when it's really intense. And I don't know what other people are doing. People say, you do it so differently. And I'm like, well, what other way is there to do it? It is effective when we have all the right clinical providers aligned philosophically. And I give that caveat because educating them, there are clinicians out there who are like, oh, no, they need inpatient. Well, what if they've been to inpatient 5 or 10 times? What if their 4 little sweet children, all 8 and under, would lose their only primary parent and be in foster care? Why not find another way? It might be challenging in the beginning, but my God, does it pay off if we can just hold fast.
Sure. So we should talk a bit about how that sort of the work that you were doing on an individual basis became the company that you have today, because it's one thing to sort of be working as an individual and being a coach and so forth, and then another thing to be running the company that you have today, which is headquartered in New York but has a presence in lots of other markets and works with a suite of clinicians and specialists and so forth. But basically you built on your foundation of working with parents in particular and built that out over a period of years, I suppose. Can you just talk about how it grew? Yeah.
I suppose it's really started growing after Dr. Aronson and I had a couple of years. It was about 2 to 3 years that I was sheltered by his governance. And I started taking on clients that weren't in that arena, 18 to 35-year-old young adults, and were in their gap years, had maybe a felony or two, whatever, drug, substance abuse, so a little bit more complex cases where they've been to treatment before. And so this model really lent itself to being effective. And what happens when you do something well, be careful, you're going to do it for the rest of your life. And so by word of mouth. And I'd say 80% of my referrals are from my alumni. And I'm taking calls. And so I would have to interview and build teams wherever they were in the world, whether that was in the UK, I was working with college students over here, and then we were asked to come into Dubai, and so we started working in the UAE, and we do a lot of work now there because they're now lifting instead of going to jail for substance abuse in the UAE, you go to treatment. And so it's not as taboo as it once was, and that wasn't the case when I began. So there's a lot of shifts around the world, and it's really sad, but good, because then, people are tackling the problems head on now.
And so your model as a firm, SilverBell Global, is to have the assessment done by yourself or a member of your team effectively. Maybe there's a coach from SBG, I think, and then to build that team around someone, you're generally bringing in specialists and clinicians in their kind of home region, wherever they are in the world.
We are, and oftentimes we will fly in doctors because there's about a fit sometimes, and many of them are licensed in different countries, have different board certifications, or they'll come to the States. We'll begin treatment in the States, and we normalize things as much as we can, and then the goal is wherever their life is, where their family is, where they want school to be, then we try to matriculate that back in. So oftentimes our cases go out over 9 months to a year on average. I'd say 18 months to not need us anymore, right? And to not need to go back to treatment. The goal is to work us out of a position. So yes, we're building infrastructure and teams, and we're assessing all along the way. And there is a structure to what we do, but again, it's not a one-size-fits-all.
Sure. And I mean, you say you're assessing all along the way throughout the process, but could you just talk about how the process starts, like how you're brought in and then what you do first of all? Because I guess that's kind of the big moment in the process that kicks it off.
Yeah, it is. I take a lot of parent calls, a lot of parent Zooms. I did a few this morning. And I always give 30 minutes to an hour away. I just want to be as helpful as I can, whether they use us or not. I'll make referrals to different treatment centers or, say if you choose to work with our program, this is what it would look like. And just give parents the agency to know that they're not alone in this. And I think there's a real relief when they meet us they don't have to be the case manager, the drug tester, the therapist anymore. Or if they do have those players in their life, they're not all working together. They're fractured. The psychiatrist isn't talking to the therapist, or the case management company that they might have had isn't utilizing their existing team because they have their own team. And I like to work with what's already working. And Dr. Aronson taught me this. So if a family comes to us with a psychiatrist or a psychologist that they're working with already, they're like, well, will you work with them? Yes, as long as it's effective. So there's a grace period. Is this therapist that they've had for 10 years open to this process? Because we want to utilize that trusting relationship. They would become one of the leaders of our team. And if they're not comfortable with it, then we will discover that over the assessment period. Initially is about 3 weeks. Sure. And then we would begin either with a new primary therapist if the family wants to continue with us, because the existing treatment team, sometimes it's out of their scope. It's not that they don't disagree with us. They're just like, I'm not comfortable with this because this is a different realm for me.
And you do have specialists and clinicians that you work with time and again. And you build up a relationship with them, and presumably that's with the people that you think are the most effective and best. Can you talk about what those relationships are built on, the kinds of people that you love to work with most?
What all relationships are built on, mutual respect. And I think there is a hierarchy, and there should be. I mean, a psychiatrist is typically a lead of a case, and a primary psychologist. But in turn, they have to respect our work and what we're doing, and the data we're collecting on a daily basis to show the dysregulation and what we are suggesting. And then we say, what do you think? And when we all come together to work together, but it's not a dogmatic approach. So I look for people who are saying, no, what do you think? No, what do you think? It doesn't mean that we're all going to go with one direction, but please value that we're accurately reporting what's happening, and let's work together to find the best path forward.
One of the things that you're very clear on, I think, is the danger that the cycle of inpatient care that some people can get wrapped up in, the danger that can present. Why does that happen, first of all? And then secondly, how can that cycle be broken?
It does happen more than it should. And I think it's just by misunderstanding or miseducation by families who, the relief of having a loved one go away to inpatient treatment, I'd say once or twice is quite normal. And if they don't have the infrastructure when they come out of inpatient treatment, the triggers, the stressors, the activation of the lifestyle that brought them into it, the people, places, and things, is going to activate them again. And so if that's what our company primarily does, is help usher people out of treatment so they can stabilize in life. So it's like keeping rehab going in real time with real life experiences so we can learn how to manage those, not to go back to treatment. So if they don't have that support system, and it doesn't have to be our company, it can be many different ways that aren't costly. There's great foundations and so on and so forth. But what happens with families is that they believe that if they would just, the identified patient, the 22-year-old that has to go away again and again and again, it's really for the family to have relief. Because if it's working for the identified patient, then why do they keep coming back in and out of treatment? We need to really slow down. They say zoom out in Hollywood, that 30,000-foot view. What's going on here from the family system? And that's what we're really not going to shy away from. They're like, oh, but families don't want to talk about it. Well, then I guess they're not ready for what we offer. That's okay. They might get to a place of pain and suffering in their family system where they're ready to pick up the phone and say, what does SilverBell offer? Or maybe I'm ready to go away to treatment. Not because they have a substance use problem, but because they just need to have a reset from a psychological perspective as well.
And just to be super clear, I think that phrase, identified patient, is very powerful and has a lot of meaning within it. Essentially, it's the idea that the person who might have the addiction problem or whatever kind of problem it is not the only one who would benefit from modulating their behavior.
Wow, you really are going there today. I appreciate this conversation. It's very honest. What identified patient really means in a lay person's term, from us who are on the inside of the behavioral health world, it means that's the symptom of the family dysfunction.
Okay.
They call it scapegoating. So, well, if so-and-so would just get better, we wouldn't have all these family problems. Now, granted, there might be some responsibility there. But really, if they are in and out of treatment for X amount of days, months, weeks, years, decades, I've seen, family really needs to come together. And oftentimes, maybe they do. And that's where having more sophisticated clinicians and thinking out of the box clinicians that I'm working with, because if you're just going to sit on a couch and do family therapy, it's probably not going to be as effective as it should be. So we bring our family therapists into the family home, do family intensives, and so it's highly effective. But there's many different ways to look at that identified patient and what it's really trying to say.
Fantastic. And do you think the field is changing? Are there kind of trends, things that have been shown to be very effective, or just ways in which that clinicians are operating, or is there a movement in your work and your field?
Big time, especially in the States, and I'm seeing it over here. I mean, my company has grown. I've always had work in the UK for the last 9 years, but over, I'd say, the last 5 or 6 years, it's grown exponentially around the world. I wouldn't even say just the UK and Europe. I'm seeing it over in the UAE, as I mentioned, and Asia starting to knock on our door quite a bit more now. And I'm just trying to grow steadily, but people are talking about it. And I think the U.S. consumers in particular, and certainly UK, they're much more educated and savvy now. They know what I'm saying. They know that a rehab is a temporary portion of a journey. 30, 60, 90 days of treatment inpatient is yet a beginning. And I always like to say it's measured in quarters, like any business, Q1, Q2, Q3, and Q4, because you can't anticipate future profits until you have a pattern. And so we can see behavioral patterns over 90 days. They say it takes 79 days to 285 days to develop a new pattern and behavior.
Okay.
And so that lends itself to about a year. And that's how businesses are measured. Isn't that interesting?
It is interesting, and I think it probably appeals to many of your clients, that way of thinking.
They're like, oh, Q1, how are we doing? Q2. It's true. We have a step down, phase out, and process. Nothing is a linear. I explain that. And so progress cannot be seen sometimes, but it actually, as long as there's a connection and they're leaning into the support system, we're still making progress.
Sure. And when you've worked with a client or a family, a whole family, what does it look like, that phase out process, when you sort of let them go on their own?
I like to call it a graduation. Okay. They graduate into fellowship, into friendship, if it's clinically appropriate. Oftentimes what has happened is our clients, I have a vetting process over years, then become coaches or case managers, and they go get their degrees, and they come back with a bit more credentialing, and they work for us. It's really a beautiful moment when they're like, you helped me so much, I want to pay this forward.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
And I just want to end our discussion on a couple of sort of pieces of advice that people might be able to use if they are dealing with some of the issues that we've been talking about. I mean, we have already had some of those pieces of advice, but more formally and encapsulated in a few words. I mean, for parents who have listened to this conversation and thought, yeah, there is something going on there. There is a way in which my child is struggling, or they could struggle more in the future if things aren't managed appropriately. What general pieces of advice might you be able to offer them?
Well, there's a couple different ways for them to think about how to ask for help. One, if they have a really wise, trusted advisor in their life, whether that's a trust and estates attorney, whether that's a private wealth manager, who do they really trust? Is it a GP? Is it a close friend who's gone through similar experiences? Ask for help with the safest person that really will give you honest advice, not just someone who's going to tell you what you want to hear and have a margarita over it. Truthfully, have a lunch, go to yoga, go for a walk. Put yourself in an environment that isn't going to lend itself to alcohol, because a lot of times it's exhausting to talk about our family, dynamics that are unhealthy, and it's embarrassing, and you need a compassionate ear. And so I would say talk to your safest, most trusted person closest to you and ask them how they got through it, if they've been through it, or who they might talk to. Because it's not going to be 6 degrees. It's going to be 1 or 2 degrees before they find a safe, healthy advisor, whether it's our company, whether it's a GP or therapist that really knows how to help treat this problem.
Fantastic. Well, Natasha Silver Bell, thank you very much indeed for joining us. It's been a fantastic conversation.
Edwin, I just want to give kudos to you for taking this to your audience. It's a brave, bold step, and I really appreciate you bringing light to this subject.
We're delighted to. Thank you.
Thank you.